Welcome back. We've just learned how to tint our objects with a particular color, but now we'd like to learn how we can tint multiple objects different colors. To do this, we're going to use a special buffer Unreal Engine has called Custom Stencil. Now, if we go into Edit, Project Settings, and go down to Rendering, and scroll to Post Processing, you'll see this Custom Depth Stencil pass. Now, it may be disabled depending on the version of the engine you're using, but make sure it's enabled with Stencil. This allows us to use the custom stencil buffer. Go ahead and close this. Now, let's take a look at base weapon BP and select our item mesh. And if we scroll down to our rendering section and open the Advanced tab, you'll see that there's a custom depth stencil value. And we can set this to a particular value, such as, say, 250. Now, the custom depth stencil value assigned to a mesh is something that is used by the custom stencil buffer. Custom stencil is similar to the custom depth, where custom depth will give you white on pixels that are not on an object in the custom depth buffer and dark values on pixels that are on the mesh. Custom depth stencil gives you a custom value when you're on the mesh. Let's take a look at how this works in the post-process highlight material. Let's maneuver up a little bit and right-click and make a scene texture node. Now for the scene texture ID, we're going to select custom stencil. Now we can drag off of color and use a mask, get a component mask and mask out all but the red. And for any given pixel, if it's on an object that's using custom stencil and has a custom stencil value assigned to it, then this will return that custom stencil value for that mesh. Now we can check to see if this is equal to a particular value by using an if node. This works a lot like an if statement in C++. It checks the value passed in for A and compares it with the value passed in for B. Let's hold 1 and create a constant and plug it in for B, and for this constant, let's give it a value of 250. That's the value I gave for the base weapon BP's item mesh for its custom stencil property. Now we can choose what comes out of this if node. We do so by putting values into these pins. If A is equal to B, in other words, the object has 250 for its custom stencil value, then whatever we plug into this A is equal to B node is what we get out of it. So we can hold 3 and click to create a color. And let's make this somewhat green. I'll give this a red value of 0.0236, a green value of 0.651, and a blue value of 0. Now I'll plug this into A is equal to B. Now if A is greater than B or less than B, we can choose a different color. Let's go ahead and hold 3 and click and just create some other random value, such as this purplish blue. And let's plug that into A is greater than B and A is less than B. Now we can use this instead of this pink magenta color that we use down here. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all these and drag them down. And I'm going to plug this result in to the B instead of our pink here. Go ahead and hit apply. Now here in the default map, we'll see that we get the green, but I can take this weapon, hold Alt and drag to duplicate it, and if I select this other instance, here in the details panel, I'm going to drag this down so I can select item mesh on this instance, and I'm going to search for custom stencil, and here's the custom depth stencil value. I'm going to change it to something other than 250, such as 251. And you'll see that it changes to blue. So whatever the number assigned to custom depth stencil value, we can check that in our material using the custom stencil scene texture ID. So we can select different values to correspond to different colors. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this green and bring it down here. And I'm going to create several more colors here. So I'm going to hold 3 and click. And for this one, I'm going to use 0.568 for the red, 0.188 for the green and 0 for the blue, that'll give me a nice sort of golden amber color. I'm going to create another color, and for this one I'm going to use 0.479 for the red, 0 for the green, and 0.426 for the blue to get a nice purple color. I'm going to create another color, and this one will be 0 red, 0.0114 for green, and 1 for blue. Next we have this green that I'm going to keep, and then finally I'll create one more, and for this one I'm going to give it 0.507 for red, 0.504 for green, and 0.521 for blue, and that's going to give me a nice gray color. Now I'm going to assign some numbers for this. I'll hold 1 and click to get a constant on each of these. Now above this amber color, I'm going to give this a value of 254. For the purple one, I'll give it a value of 253. For the blue, I'll give it a value of 252. Green's going to be 251, and gray is going to be 250. So how do we select the color based on the number? Well, I'm going to go ahead and delete this other color here. Now it's going to complain because it's saying that if A greater than B input has no value being put into it, so we get an error. That's okay because we're not done yet. I'm going to delete this 250 here. Now I'm going to scroll out and make sure we have enough room here. Now this first if check here is going to compare A with 254. If A is greater than, equal to, or less than B, I'm going to use this amber color for all three. Now I'm going to create another if, and you can do this by holding the I key and left clicking. That's sort of a shortcut. And I'm going to go ahead and compare the output for custom stencil with 253. Now if A is greater than B, for example, if we're a Texel that's on a mesh assigned a value 254 for its custom stencil property, then we'd like to use the result of this if, which is the golden amber color. But if it's equal or less than 253, then let's go ahead and use the purple. Now I'm going to hold I and click to create another if, and I'm going to compare the custom stencil value to 252 this time. And I'm going to say if A is greater than B, let's use the result of this if. And if it's equal or less, we're going to use this blue value. Let's create another if. We're going to plug in the custom stencil for A and 251 for B. And if A is greater than B, we're going to use the result of the blue if. And if it's less than or equal, we're going to use green. And finally, we're going to create one more if. We're going to use the result from the custom stencil for A, and we're comparing it to 250 this time. And if A is greater than B, we're going to use the previous if, and if it's equal to or less than, we're going to use gray. This allows us to have this one single output, and the output is going to have a color depending on the value of the current pixel's custom stencil. Now it'll be 0 if we're on a pixel that's on a mesh that doesn't have a custom stencil value assigned to it. But if it does, and that value is say 250, then we'll get gray. But if that value is greater than 250, we'll get this value. Well, what is this value? Well, this value depends on A and B. If the custom stencil value is 251, then we simply get the green value. Now, if it's less than 251, say 250, we already saw that it would be gray. But if it's greater than 251, then we get this value. Now here, if it's 252, we get blue. But if it's greater than 252, we get this value. Now, if it's 253, we get purple. But if it's greater, we get this value. And if this value is 254, we get amber. And in fact, if it's even greater than 254, we still get amber because we plugged it into all three. Ultimately, this results in the correct color depending on that custom stencil value. So we can go ahead and put a comment around all this, and we'll say return different colors based on custom stencil values. And we can use this right here in the multiply that used to have this pink plugged in. So I'm going to go ahead and take this and plug it in to the multiply here and delete that pink. So let's apply this and we'll go back into the level. Now we can make some copies of the gun. So select one of these weapons and make sure that we have base weapon BP2 self-selected. So we're selecting the actor itself and not one of its components, like the mesh component. Now we can go ahead and hold Alt and drag to duplicate this so we have multiple weapons here. Now for the first one, we'll let this have a custom depth stencil value of 250. The second one will have a custom depth stencil value of 251. For the third one, let's give it a value of 252. For the fourth one, we'll give it 253. And for the fifth one, we'll give it 254. And now you see that each one is tinted a different color. Now in our material, we're also using this color for the outline. And we can instead use the result of our color assignment. So let's click off of our last if here and drag up where we're using this color for the outline and click apply. And now in our default map, we can see the outlines are the correct colors as well. Now if these are a little too dark, we can multiply these by a softening factor. Let's go back to our post-process highlight. And right here at the final alpha, which is lerping based on this 1 minus x, where 1 is on a mesh, not including the border, in which case we get B, which is our tinted value. We can take this alpha and we can scale it by some sort of number. Let's hold M and click to make a multiply and take this 1 minus x and plug it in for A and use the result as the alpha for our final lerp. And we'll go ahead and hold 1 to click and make a constant. And let's put this at a value of, say, 0.5. And we'll comment this and say, soften the tint. And for our final lerp, why don't we comment this as well and say A is scene plus border. And B is tinted object. Okay, let's hit apply and go back to our scene. And now each color is softened up a little bit. It's not quite tinted as harshly. So we can affect this by our scalar value here. Now remember, there was this occlusion problem. Let's go back and go behind this wall. And it's barely visible, but you can still see the tinting color behind this wall, even though it's occluded. So once again, we need to come in here and find this 1 minus x, where 0 is occluded, 1 is not occluded. And we need to get this value and multiply it by the alpha going into our final lerp. So let's type multiply. And we'll go ahead and highlight these and move them over a bit. And let's multiply these values for the alpha here. And we'll give this a comment and say mask out occluded objects. Now it's getting a little bit spaghetti code because here in the materials editor, it can be a bit harder to organize. But that's okay. Once we create this material, then all we need to do is use it. Go ahead and apply this, and let's test this out. And there we have it. We cannot see the outline through the objects occluding our weapons. And we can go ahead and press play and see that our weapon has the tint, but it is not showing through any occluding mesh. It's kind of hard to see with the gray, so we can go to our weapons, base weapon BP, select the item mesh. So let's try a value of 253 and hit play. And now we see the value of purple and it's not showing through the occluding shoulder there. Okay, that's going to conclude this video. We now have an outline effect and we have a color tinting effect, and it depends on the value assigned for the custom stencil value property on any given mesh. In the next video, we're going to add to the coolness factor by including a nice line effect that'll scroll down the item. So stay tuned.